Over the years, the tabletop role-playing genre has entered into and out of popularity. Thanks to social media and an era of digital media, the community has seen new bright-eyed adventurers excited for a journey of 1,000 words. And as the hobby becomes more and more accessible, thankfully less and less of the player base has to deal with what some veterans fondly remember as the absolute nightmare of being part of the hobby early on. And it was much less the judgment, or being pushed around in school for having a cool hobby that let me sit in a dark basement with a hooded robe while speaking inhuman dialects. It was more so the changes needed in the game itself. Since its time before publication before the Red Box edition, the Dungeons & Dragons Rulebook has seen 5 full evolutions, with hundreds of books supplementing additional rules, new classes, and unseen monsters. And now, with its D&D 2024 edition released, players who picked up the pen and paper in the 5th edition get to experience what many have in the past, seeing the change between versions. So, I thought it'd be nice to take some time and take a look back at the evolution of Dungeons & Dragons as a system, through the eyes of the Omnipotent. Ask any forever DM and they'll tell you what initially stops most people from playing the game is a fear of doing it wrong. And as if we read off of a script, the response that we give as DMs desperately trying to fill in just one more slot in a campaign is that there isn't a way to play it wrong. Though some opinions differ, many camps of ideology around playing TTRPGs all agree on one simple truth. If you're having fun, you're doing it right. But that doesn't change the daunting amount of information, and not always having a DM nearby to answer all the questions or translate the absolute gibberish used tends to lead most adventures to be unstarted. Unsurprisingly, the first edition of D&D was a simple packet of 3 booklets, 112 pages of information to get any person started on an adventure of a lifetime. Back then, it wasn't that the rules were straight up vague, it was that they were brutally complicated and specific. Now mind you, most people now understand what a hit dice is, how to roll for the attack, or what leveling up is thanks to video games. But even more so now, there are more available experienced DMs with an access to a wealth of information to help guide these new players. And back then, a referee having played Empire of the Petal Throne, a system of which Gary Gygax was a massive fan and took inspiration from, was rare. This was, for the most part, a completely new and unique expansive game system. Now, I will spare you from most of the historical details of Gygax's issues with the D&D basic set, but just know that of the 2 systems that were being created at the same time, the later 1977 non-Gygax release was meant to be a simpler entrance into the system, one that you would eventually graduate from. But those books aren't what the current game is based on. Instead, Gygax cooked up a D&D, an expansion of the original system, chock full of new rules, explanations on how they work, and a neat little section where the writers give you an example dialogue between DMs and players so you could see how the rules worked in-game. It was a complete system, bundled into 3 books. But this is where the first roadblock in the system appeared. See, Gygax's vision for D&D was for it to function more as a complex simulation of fantasy adventure, and less of a sandbox. To him, it was more fun to have the players balance their gold to make sure that they could upkeep their weapons and gear, or to have a room at the end to sleep in. An encumbrance system was put in place so that the players would need to think about what treasures they pick up, since moving slower means longer travel times, and longer travel times meant more food being eaten, which brings us back to needing to make more money. Although it gave players reasoning to go out and adventure, it came at the cost of making this complicated mesh of systems. And now, jumping forward in time and with the release of 3rd edition, 3.5 edition, and the infamous 4th edition, we find an upward trend in popularity as new players entered the hobby in waves. Back in those days, a local game shop in the United States would be commonplace on Wednesdays, Saturdays, or Sundays, where one could sign up for something called the Adventurers League, a place where you could make a character and just jump into an adventure at the store with a bunch of strangers. But solving availability wasn't the final piece of the puzzle. Sure, people couldn't play otherwise unless they could somehow convince a few of their friends to try out this new hobby, but that process was made much easier when those friends were shown the rules and realized that the system was easy to understand. But what exactly changed? Starting with the jump to 3rd edition, a relatively larger company had taken over TSR, the original publisher that had worked with Gygax to release Dungeons & Dragons. You might know them from the popular works that they were releasing around that time, like Robo Rally or The Primal Order, maybe even Everway or Guillotine. Oh, and 2 very popular card games that might need videos on their own, Pokemon the TCG and Magic the Gathering. I'm of course talking about Wizards of the Coast, who, upon acquiring TSR and its product lines, rewrote the books with a few rules in mind. Number 1. Retain as much of the original content for the already present player base. On the literal first page of the 3E handbook, the writers state that they had to make changes to keep up with the evolving player base. And whether or not it is true, they made these changes based on what those already playing the game thought about D&D. However, in that same paragraph, they state that the updates were made to the game system, streamlining certain rules and expanding on others. Outside of that, the system would be compatible with previous products, with, and I quote, minor adjustments. The second rule applied was to make the D20 system standardized. Before, Dungeons & Dragons worked off of the THAC0, or to hit armor class 0 system, something based on tabletop war games at the time where you would have to do relative math, and people hate math. Hi, I'm people. D20 as an engine would focus on streamlining as much as it could, reducing most actions to a simple 1 or 2 rolls that can be determined as a success or failure relatively easier. Case in point, to roll an attack in the old system versus an AC 3 enemy, you would first need to look at your attack or THAC0 stat, subtract the 3 from the opponent, and then roll above that number. So if your THAC0 stat was a 20, you would have to roll a 17 or better on a 20-sided die. Even now, as I'm writing this script, my head hurts. So I hope the math on the screen makes more sense than my words. Anyways, the third rule applied was to give the players freedom. Removing the rules on social interactions in the game was one of the many changes, but an important one that focused the rules onto combat, and letting players express themselves without restriction outside the dungeon and away from the dragons. I could go on, but by now you should realize that the system changes made affected the course of the game completely. Popularity is relative, but the game rules being simplified invited more and more players into the space by getting rid of the fluff. Although I do sometimes itch to run an AD&D session here and there, I would never use that system to introduce a player to the hobby of tabletop role-playing games, unless they wanted to get thrown into the wood chipper as quickly as possible. If I were to equate each edition of D&D to what type of gamer I would be introducing to TTRPGs, Dungeons & Dragons 1E would be for the board game and tabletop war gamers, RTS players, enjoyers of a casual Civ 5 game. It doesn't play like Catan, but with an emphasis on gameplay with minis and resource management, players who like the spreadsheet part of EVE Online probably would enjoy the first edition. AD&D is where I throw the Dark Souls enjoyers, challenge runners, and speedrunners. Perilous quests where a wrong move or decision an hour ago could lead to an untimely death. A system where those who find re-rolling a character or just having 5 ready before the session starts can find a home. 3rd and 3.5e are where we can put the JRPG enjoyers. Those who want story and progression, the few who sit through the cutscenes in games without ever getting close to the skip button. They would enjoy not having to get a degree to understand how everything works, and where you only need to be good at the things you find interesting, and not having an answer is an answer in itself. And the 4th edition is where I would recommend MMO players to start. Classes all organized into skill trees with their own little toolbox of solutions. A straightforward progression system where truly the only resource you need to manage in combat are your cooldowns. Of course, trying either of the 2 most recent editions could do the job, but the joy of being in this hobby with its history of changes and introducing new players to it is that there are so many things to show them that will get them hooked. From a realistic adventure simulation, to a misguided network of tables and rules, to becoming almost a recreation into a player-driven MMO, Dungeons & Dragons has changed over the many years to bring joy to many players. As either a veteran or fledgling game master, it is our job to seek out what system can bring the most joy. It may not always come in a new shiny box, and may be decades old, but I challenge you, the listener, to maybe find some older system to try out. Maybe pick up the dice with some friends and make new memories. Maybe become the GM yourself and experience the world through the eyes of the Omnipotent.